I woke up at first light as I had done for the last 45 years. Old habits don't die, I realized when I retired 5 years ago. My body still rises at 5:30 in the morning, as if it has a built-in alarm clock that can't be turned off. As I reached for the empty half of the bed, I felt Eleanor's absence for the umpteenth time. 3 years have passed and I still look for her beside me in the mornings. They say time heals, but it only teaches you how to live with the emptiness inside. I'm 68 and I'm still not used to waking up alone. My name is Walter Thorpe. I've worked all my life as a construction site inspector in our little town of Lyman. It's not the most rewarding job, always being the guy who points out the flaws and makes you redo them. But I was proud that, thanks to me, not a single building in Lyman had collapsed or cracked in 30 years. Eleanor always said I was too picky. "Walter, you'll find something to be picky about in heaven," she laughed. Maybe she was right. But it was that attention to detail that allowed us to save enough to buy a second house, a small but cozy cottage on the outskirts of town. We planned to rent it out to have an extra income in retirement. Fate had it differently. Eleanor passed away from cancer so quickly that I didn't have time to realize what was happening. 3 months from diagnosis to, the end. I thought I blinked and was alone in our big house, where every corner reminded me of her. And then there they were, Hugo and Payton, my grandson and his newfound wife. Hugo is the son of my only daughter, Verity. I've always been closer to him than the rest of my grandchildren. Maybe because he's so much like me when I was young, just as stubborn and straightforward. Or maybe it's because he spent every summer with Eleanor and me as a child while Verity tried to get her life together after her divorce. When Hugo announced 2 years ago that he was marrying Payton Eswell, I was happy for him. I remember their first visit to my house after the wedding. Payton was a petite blonde with a sharp chin and an even sharper gaze. She worked as a receptionist at a dental clinic, and Hugo worked in a building materials warehouse. Young, bright-eyed, full of plans for the future. "Grandpa, we found a great apartment," Hugo said then. "Small, but in a good neighborhood." "The rent eats up half of our budget," Payton added, smiling, "but it's temporary. We're saving for a down payment on our house." I looked at them and saw me and Eleanor 40 years ago, just as young, just as hopeful, and then it hit me. "Look, I have a second home. It's been empty for over a year. Why would you rent if you could live there?" Hugo froze with his mouth open. "Grandpa, we can't accept a gift like that." But I insisted. The house was empty anyway, and the thought of having a part of my family living there warmed my heart. We formalized the gift, although, to be honest, I never finished all the legal formalities. I kept postponing and postponing the visit to the notary and then somehow forgot. Things went well for the first year. I visited them regularly, helped with the renovations that never seemed to end in the old house. Hugo inherited my love of working with his hands, always sawing, drilling, painting. Payton would cook dinners when I came over, and the three of us would sit on the porch discussing Lyman news. But about 6 months ago, something changed. At first I couldn't figure out what it was. I just felt some tension when I went over to their house. Payton cooked less and less when I visited, and more often she remembered something urgent and left, leaving Hugo and me alone. And then Hugo lost his job. The warehouse where he had worked for 5 years had closed. The owner had sold the business to a competitor. Hugo was offered to stay, but with a demotion and a pay cut. He refused, proud, like me when I was young. "I'll find something better, Grandpa," he told me over the phone. "Don't worry." But as the weeks went by, he didn't find a new job. And then I noticed Payton starting to change. One day I arrived unannounced, bringing them fresh tomatoes from my garden. I drove up to the house and saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway, a brand new silver sedan. I figured they had company and I was about to call Hugo to get out of the way, but then I saw Payton getting out of the car. She hadn't seen me. I'd parked a little farther away under a big oak tree. She was wearing a new dress I'd never seen before and shoes that weren't cheap. She looked content with her life, not at all like the wife of an unemployed man. I didn't show my face. I turned around and drove away, leaving the tomatoes for later. Something was bothering me. A week later, I showed up again, this time with advance notice. Payton met me in shabby jeans and an old Hugo t-shirt. No expensive shoes or dresses. "Walter, it's so good of you to come," she said with a strained smile. "Hugo was just about to call you. We're having a little financial difficulty." I wasn't surprised. I gave them money, for groceries, for bills. Hugo was grateful and embarrassed at the same time. He promised to pay me back as soon as he got a job. "Take your time," I told him. "That's what a family is for, to support each other in times of need." 2 weeks later, history repeated itself, and two more. Each time, the amount they asked for got bigger and bigger. And each time I gave, not because I was rich, but because I could not refuse my only grandson. But the worm of doubt had already settled in me, especially after the accident with the car. I started to come unannounced. I was supposedly passing through, or I forgot something on my last visit. And each time I noticed details that didn't add up to the picture of a poor family. The new TV in the living room, Payton's designer handbag tossed carelessly on the couch, the bottle of expensive whiskey at the bar. But the strangest thing was happening to Payton. When she knew I was coming, she was the epitome of modesty and frugality. But when I caught her off guard, she was a different woman, cold, irritable, looking at me as a nuisance. Hugo didn't seem to notice the change, or didn't want to. He was becoming more and more withdrawn, spending hours on his computer, supposedly looking for work. But I could see something was breaking in the guy. He'd always been proud, and now he had to live on handouts from his old grandfather. In the last month, I began to notice that the money I gave for specific needs, to fix the roof, to replace the pipes in the bathroom, disappeared somewhere, and the work remained undone. "The contractor took the deposit and disappeared," Hugo explained, averting his eyes. "We're looking for a new one." I nodded, pretending to believe him. But inside, I was seething. I'd worked on construction sites for 40 years, and I knew how much these jobs cost and how to choose contractors. And then something happened that finally opened my eyes. I arrived on a weekday. Hugo was supposed to be at a job interview. He wanted to see the roof, get an idea of the scope of work. Maybe I could have done it myself. My hands still remembered the tools. As I drove up to the house, I saw 3 cars in the driveway. One of them was the silver sedan. The door was unlocked, and there were women's voices and laughter coming from the living room. I walked in quietly, about to call Payton's name, but stopped when I heard my name. "Did the old man splurge again?" An unfamiliar female voice asked. I recognized Payton's laugh immediately. "Yeah, $2,000 to fix the roof, which, by the way, is perfectly fine." "And he doesn't check?" "He's 85. What's a checkup?" Payton exaggerated my age by almost 20 years. "The key is to make a pitiful face and hint that Hugo's gone to pieces." "Does your husband mind?" A pause. Then Payton sighed. "Hugo. He makes everything so complicated. He says we have to be honest with his grandfather, that we can't ask for money if we're not going to spend it on what we're asking for." "So, what did you do?" "What did I do?" "I told him if he's so principled he should go work as a janitor or a loader. He just shut up." Laughter, glasses clinking. I stood in the hallway feeling my insides chill. "Listen, what if the old man suspects something wrong?" Another woman's voice asked. "What would he do? The house is already ours. It's technically a gift. He can't even take it back." "What if he stops giving money?" Payton snorted. "He won't. He adores Hugo, his only grandson who looked so much like him when he was young." She said the last words with a sneer, clearly mocking me. "Plus, he's got plenty of savings. He's been working all his life saving. What's an old man gotta spend it on? Just us. I went out quietly, closing the door behind me. I sat in the car and looked at the house I had once bought with Eleanor, dreaming of a peaceful old age. His wife's voice echoed in his head. "Walter, you're too trusting when it comes to family." Maybe I am. But there's a limit to everything, even my patience and love for my grandson. I started the car and drove away, knowing full well that I wouldn't let myself be fooled again. It was time to show Payton that this old man wasn't out of his mind, and that the Thorpes are not to be trifled with. For a week after I overheard that conversation, I didn't show up at Hugo and Payton's house. I didn't call. I didn't return messages. I needed time to process what I'd heard and decide how to proceed. Hugo called first. He sounded worried. "Grandpa, are you okay?" "Payton and I are worried." Yeah, especially Payton, I thought, but I said aloud, "I'm fine, just a little sick. Age takes its toll. Should we come over? Anything to help?" I could almost physically feel Payton standing next to him, listening to the conversation, probably already calculating how much he could get from the sick old man. "It's not worth it," I said. "I'd better come by myself one of these days. I want to see how the repair of the roof is progressing." There was a pause. Then Hugo coughed. "Grandfather, the roof. There's been some problems with the roof. The contractor said that the materials have gone up in price, and—" "I understand," I interrupted him. "Don't worry. We'll sort it out on the spot." After the call, I sat in the chair for a long time, looking at Eleanor's picture. She was looking at me with the same soft smile that had made my heart beat faster for 42 years. "What would you do, Ellie?" I asked the photograph. "You always were a better judge of character." There was no answer, of course, but I knew Eleanor never approved of lies and manipulation, even if they came from family members. "Love doesn't mean blindness, Walter," she often said. 3 days later, I arrived at their house as promised. I called ahead to make sure I'd catch them both at home. Hugo met me with a strained smile. He'd lost weight, shadows under his eyes. I knew that look. It was the look of someone with something eating away at him. Payton came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, the perfect picture of a caring hostess. But I noticed that her nails were freshly painted bright red, and a new bracelet glistened on her wrist. "Walter, how nice to see you," she exclaimed. Hugo was frantic, thinking something had happened to you. I smiled back, trying not to make it look too fake. "I thought I'd check on you guys, and take a look at the roof, since there was some kind of problem." Payton and Hugo looked at each other. "How about some tea first?" Payton suggested it. "I just made your favorite apple pie. My favorite is blueberry, not apple, but I didn't bother to correct her. Let's do business first, then tea. It's a short day, and I want to see everything in good light." Hugo took me upstairs to the attic where I had access to the roof. On the way, he talked a lot, rambling on and on about the difficulty of finding a job, about how hard it was to start over at their age, about the rising prices of everything. I listened half listening, noting to myself the new plasma screen in the living room and the designer pillows on the couch. Hard times, indeed. The attic was dusty and smelled damp. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and started inspecting the rafters and battens. As I expected, there were no major problems with the roof. A couple of small leaks that could easily be fixed for a few $100s, not the $2,000 I'd given for emergency repairs. "Hugo," I said, turning to my grandson, "do you remember what I told you about honesty?" He looked away. "Grandpa, this roof doesn't need any major repairs. It just needs a couple of patches. A day's work, no more." Hugo turned pale. Payton said that the contractor." He stammered. "What contractor, Hugo?" I came closer. "No one was working here. No one at all." The grandson lowered his head. At that moment, he looked like a kid caught stealing apples from a neighbor's orchard. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I knew the roof was fine, But Payton said we needed money and you'd still give. He hesitated, realizing what he'd said. I stared at him in silence. I wasn't angry. Rather, I felt deep disappointment. My grandson, whom I had taught honesty and integrity, had cheated me for money, for his wife. What did the money go for, Hugo? He shrugged. Payton handles our finances. She said we needed to update our closet for job interviews, and that if I wanted to get a good job, I had to look the part. What about a new TV? The bracelet on your wife's arm? Is that for job interviews too? Hugo shuddered. Grandpa, it's not like that. Don't lie to me again. I held up my hand, stopping the flow of excuses. I'm too old for this shit. We walked downstairs in heavy silence. Payton had already set the table for tea, arranging the best china, the same china I'd given them for the housewarming party. So, everything okay with the roof? She asked with a smile. I looked her straight in the eye. It's fine. No repairs needed. Her smile became strained. But the contractor said, There was no contractor, Payton, I said calmly but firmly. We both know that. She cast a quick glance at Hugo, who stood with his shoulders slumped. Walter, I don't know what you mean. Hugo, tell your grandfather he's wrong. Hugo remained silent, looking at the floor. I want to know where the money I gave for the repairs went, I said, sitting down at the table. Not just the roof, but the pipes in the bathroom and the replacement windows in the bedroom. Payton let out a nervous laugh. Walter, this is some kind of misunderstanding. We spent the money on exactly what you gave it for. If something hasn't been done, it's because the work is still in progress. I pulled out my phone and showed the photos I took a few minutes ago in the attic. There's no sign of repairs, Payton. None at all. She pressed her lips into a thin line. The mask of concerned daughter-in-law slipped from her face. What? Are you following us? Checking up on us? We're not children to account for every dime. When those cents are mine, I have a right to know where they're going, I replied, still calm. Payton threw the napkin on the table. Hugo, are you going to sit there and let your grandfather accuse us of stealing? Hugo finally looked up. I saw a mixture of shame and confusion in his eyes. Payton, we haven't exactly been honest with Grandpa. What? She turned to him, her face contorted with anger. Are you taking his side now? It's not about sides, I interjected. It's about the truth. You took my money for a specific need and spent it on something else. That's called cheating. Payton stood up abruptly, knocking over the cup. Tea spilled all over the white tablecloth. You come here too often, Walter. This is our house, not yours. You gave it to us, remember? And now you're acting like it's still yours. I gave it to you to help you, not so you could use it as an excuse to get money out of me. Nobody's taking money out of you, she raised her voice. We're just trying to survive while Hugo can't get a job. Survive? I put my hand around the living room. With a new TV, designer furniture, and jewelry? Payton narrowed her eyes. So that's it? Now you're going to dictate what we can and can't buy? No, I shook my head. But I will no longer give you money for repairs you don't make. Fine, she blurted out. We don't need your handouts. We'll do it ourselves. Hugo finally snapped out of his stupor. Payton, please calm down. Grandpa has a right to know where his money is going. She turned to him and her voice became deceptively soft. Of course, dear. Just remind me, who paid for your retraining course that you never finished? Who bought you a new laptop for your job search? Who paid your beer bills with your friends when you supposedly went on job interviews? Hugo turned even paler. That's not fair, Payton. Unfair? She laughed. It's not fair that I'm working at the clinic to keep us afloat while you can't find a job for months. And your grandfather is now accusing us of stealing instead of helping us. I watched this scene in silence. I could see the real Payton in front of me now, not the sugary sweet daughter-in-law she'd portrayed to me. And I saw how she manipulated my grandson, making him feel guilty, inferior. I've always helped you, I said calmly. I will continue to help you, but I won't give you any more money for non-existent repairs. If you need financial support, just say so." Payton snorted. "How noble! Should we get down on our knees and beg for alms?" "Payton, enough." Hugo suddenly raised his voice. "Grandpa's right. We were unfair to him." She gave him an icy stare. "So you're on his side. That's fine. Then maybe he'll sleep with you tonight because I'm not going to." With those words, she skipped out of the room, slamming the door loudly. Hugo and I sat in silence, interrupted only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the same clock that had once hung in my living room. "I'm sorry, grandfather," Hugo said at last. "I shouldn't have let it happen." I patted him on the shoulder. "You're between two fires, boy. I understand, but lying never leads to good." "I know." He rubbed his face with his hands. "It's just so complicated. Payton works really hard, and I feel useless." "You'll find a job, Hugo. You've always been tenacious." "Like you," he smiled weakly. "Like me," I nodded. "Look, I gotta go. We'll talk later, when everyone's cooled down a little." Hugo walked me to the door. When I was already on the threshold, he asked quietly, "Grandpa, you're not going to stop coming to see us, are you?" I turned around and looked at the house I had once bought with so much love and hope. "I won't. It's still a part of my life, and so are you." For the next 2 weeks, I didn't let on about me. Hugo called a few times, but the conversations were short and strained. He apologized, saying that he and Payton had talked about a lot of things, that she was just stressed out about the financial difficulties. I pretended to believe him. And then Hugo called with good news. He'd gotten a job at a building materials company. Not a warehouse like before, but an office position with growth prospects. "It's all thanks to you, Grandpa," he said excitedly. "Remember Frank Hobbs? He's the manager there now, and you once helped him with a project." I remembered Frank, a smart guy who always followed safety rules, unlike most construction workers. "That's great news, Hugo. I'm proud of you. Come over for dinner this Friday night. We'll celebrate. Payton's making your favorite pie." I knew he meant blueberry, but I wasn't sure if Payton knew that. "Of course I will." On Friday, I arrived exactly at the appointed time, 6 in the evening. As I parked in front of the house, I noticed that Hugo's car wasn't in its usual spot. There was a familiar silver sedan in the driveway and another car I hadn't seen before. I called Hugo. "Grandpa, I'm sorry, I got stuck at work." I could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "The introductory training had gone on too long. I'll be there in an hour tops. Payton's home. She'll meet you there." "Don't worry," I replied. "I can wait." "Thanks for understanding. I'll see you soon." I hung up the phone and walked to the door. The bell didn't work, another little thing that needed fixing, but for some reason I didn't have enough money for. I knocked. No one opened. I knocked again, louder. No answer. I knew Payton was home, her car was there, muffled voices and laughter coming from the windows. I pulled out my key, the one I still had from when I owned the house, and opened the door. It was dark in the hallway, but there was light coming from the living room and women's voices. I headed that way, about to call out to Payton, but stopped on the threshold when I saw the scene before me. Payton and her 2 friends, the same ones I'd seen the last time I'd been there, were sitting with glasses of wine. There were appetizers on the coffee table, clearly not cheap. There was no dinner to celebrate Hugo's new job. "Was he really going to come?" one of her friends asked, a blonde woman with a short haircut. Payton nodded, sipping from her glass. The old man wouldn't miss the opportunity to be happy for his favorite grandson. Besides, he thinks I made his favorite pie. "Did you?" asked the other friend, a redhead with freckles. "Of course not," Payton snorted. "We'll order something when Hugo gets here." The old man wouldn't know home-cooked food from delivery. "What's he doing at this dinner anyway?" the blonde asked. Payton smiled, and I didn't like that smile. "Because now that Hugo's got a job, we need to think about the future, a house of our own. and we need money for a down payment." "And you think he's going to chip in after your last fight?" the redhead asked skeptically. "He will," Payton smiled smugly. "I've been working on Hugo for a week now. Poor Grandpa, he wanted to help so much, and we lied to him. We have to redeem ourselves, Hugo. Invite him to dinner, make up with him, and then, when he's feeling sorry for us." "You're a genius," the blonde exclaimed. "How much do you plan to pull this time?" Payton shrugged. "I'm thinking about $20,000 to start, for a good down payment. We'll say we want to buy a house in the neighborhood to be closer to him." "Would he believe that?" "Of course he will. We're such caring grandchildren," Payton snorted again. "Besides, he's getting older. At his age, you don't follow the money so closely. It's getting easier and easier to milk an old man." They laughed, and I stood in the doorway feeling my insides boiling with anger. Not for myself, but for Hugo, for the way this woman was manipulating him and using both of us. "Milking the old man, huh?" I said loud and clear. All three of us jumped in surprise. Payton dropped her glass, and the red wine spilled over the light-colored carpet, another piece of furniture they'd bought with my money. "Whoa, Walter," she exhaled. "We didn't hear you come in." "Obviously," I said, taking a step into the room, too busy planning how to get more money out of me. Payton's friends looked up from the couch. "We should probably go," the blonde muttered. No, stay," I gestured invitingly. "I won't be long. I just wanted to make sure I understood my dear daughter-in-law's intentions." Payton's friends quickly gathered their purses and slipped out of the room, mumbling awkward apologies. I paid them no attention. My gaze was fixed on Payton, who, having recovered from her initial shock, was now looking at me with defiance. "It's not good to eavesdrop, Walter," she said, crossing her arms over her chest. "Really?" I nodded. "Neither is planning to deceive relatives." Payton shook her shoulder as if shaking off an invisible speck of dust. "You've got it all wrong. We were just kidding." "Of course," my voice oozed sarcasm. "Milking the old man is a great joke. Hugo would appreciate it." Her eyes narrowed at the mention of her husband. "Don't you dare bring Hugo into this. This is between us." "Between us?" I raised my eyebrows. "And I thought it was about my grandson, too, especially considering how you manipulate him." "I'm not!" she exclaimed. "I care about our future, our family, which is more than I can say for Hugo, who hasn't been able to find a decent job in years." I shook my head. "And that's why you decided to use me as an ATM machine, lying about repairs, about expenses, and now you're planning to swindle me out of $20,000. Payton glanced at the clock, the antique floor clock I'd restored with my own hands and given them for their anniversary. "Hugo will be back soon," she said, changing tactics. "Let's not spoil the evening. He's so excited about his new job." "Oh, yes," I nodded. "The job he got because of my connections. Did you plan to use that against me, too?" She looked away, and that gesture told me more than any words could. Of course I was. "You know what the saddest part is, Payton," I continued. "I really wanted to help you. Gave you a house, gave you money, supported you in any way I could. Not for gratitude, but because you're family. But that doesn't mean anything to you, does it?" "Don't lecture me," she snapped. "You gave us this house, and it's ours. Period. And if you keep prying into our lives, demanding accountability for every dime—" I raised my hand to stop her. "I'm not giving you another dime. And I will never set foot in this house again." Payton smiled like she'd been waiting for this. "That's good. I think it's best for everyone." I headed for the exit, but I stopped at the door. "Tell Hugo I called. Tell him I had a bad back and couldn't make it. I don't want to spoil his excitement about his new job." "How noble of you," Payton snorted. "Don't worry, I'll tell him." I nodded and walked out, knowing she'd probably lie to Hugo and make up some story about how I'd refused to come or been rude to her. But what could I do? Hugo was a grown man, and it was his choice to believe his wife over me. At home, I sat in a chair for a long time, looking at the pictures of the family arranged on the mantelpiece. Eleanor and I on our wedding day. Our daughter Verity at her high school graduation. Hugo on his birthday, a little curl of red face and clenched fists. "What would you do, Ellie?" I asked my wife's picture again. This time I thought I heard her answer, "Protect Hugo from that woman, by any means necessary." The next few days passed in silence. Hugo didn't call. Apparently Payton had indeed come up with a convincing story. I could have called myself, but something held me back. Pride, perhaps, or the realization that anything I said would be interpreted by Payton in a way that favored her. On the third day, the doorbell rang. It was about 10 in the morning, and I had just finished breakfast. When I opened the door, I saw Hugo. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept for several nights. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped back silently, letting him into the house. We walked into the kitchen, where I poured us both coffee. "How's the new job going?" I asked, setting the cup in front of him. "Good," he nodded without looking up. "It's interesting. A lot of new things." "That's good." There was a long pause. Finally, Hugo looked up. "Grandpa, Payton said that you don't want to hang out with us anymore, that you called us ungrateful and—" He hesitated. "And what else?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "That you demanded all the money you gave us back." He looked embarrassed. "I knew that wasn't true. You never asked for what you gave out of the goodness of your heart." "You're right," I nodded. "I never have, and never will ask for a refund. But the fact that I don't want to talk to you anymore, that's true, Hugo. At least not with Payton." He sighed, as if he'd been expecting that answer. "What happened that night? Payton said you didn't show up for dinner, and then accused her of some shenanigans." I sipped my coffee, gathering my thoughts. Was it worth telling him the truth? Would he believe me over his wife? "I'm here, Hugo. Payton was with her friends. They weren't cooking any dinner to celebrate your new job. They—" Eavesdropping again? He interrupted me, and I could hear the irritation in his voice. "Grandpa, I know you're worried, but this is too much." I didn't say anything, realizing that Payton had already worked him over, that I'm a senile old man who's out of his mind and minding his own business. "Why are you here, Hugo?" He's squirming in his chair. "Payton thinks we need to set the record straight, to avoid any future misunderstandings." "And what does that mean?" Hugo took a deep breath. "She doesn't think you should come to our house. At least not for a while, until things settle down." I felt my insides tighten, not from pain or resentment, but from realizing how deeply Payton had driven a wedge between me and my grandson. "I understand," I said calmly. "Well, tell Payton I won't impose." "Grandpa, it's not like—" he stammered again. "We just want some space, to start living on our own without my interference," I finished for him. "I understand, Hugo. Don't worry." He looked unhappy, but at the same time I could see the relief in his eyes. Relief that the unpleasant conversation was almost over, and he could go home to his wife with a victory. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling an envelope out of his pocket. Payton had drawn up some kind of agreement. I took the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. What I read made me chuckle, despite the seriousness of the situation. "Visitation Agreement," the heading read. It went on to say that I would agree to make all visits in advance, not to stay longer than 2 hours, not to criticize the homeowner's decisions, and, the cherry on the cake, to pay a disturbance fee of $3,500 monthly if I wanted to visit more than once a week. "Is this a joke?" I asked, looking at my grandson. Hugo blushed. I told Payton it was too much, but she insisted. She said the house needs maintenance, and if you want to come often, you have to do your part. "My share," I repeated slowly. "To the house I gave you." "Technically, yes," he looked away. "Look, I know what it looks like. But Payton's just trying to set boundaries. She's saying you're too controlling and— Stop, I held up my hand. I'm not signing this, whatever it is, and I won't pay for the right to see my own grandson. That's what I thought, Hugo sighed. Well, I guess we'd better not see each other for a while then, until things settle down. He stood up, leaving his coffee untouched. I gotta go to work. Thanks for listening. I walked him to the door in silence. On the threshold, he turned around as if he wanted to say something but changed his mind. He just nodded and left. I went back to the kitchen and stared at the agreement on the table for a long time. $3,500 a month. For the house I'd given them out of the goodness of my heart, for the right to see my own grandson. Something snapped in me at that moment. It wasn't my heart. It was already broken when I saw Payton manipulating Hugo. Rather, it was the last thread of patience that kept me from taking decisive action. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number. Albert Cranston, a familiar voice answered. Albert, this is Walter Thorpe. I need your help. Albert was an old friend of mine and, more importantly, an excellent real estate attorney. We had worked together for decades. He often advised the construction companies I inspected. Walter, haven't heard from you in ages. What's up? I briefly outlined the situation, omitting the emotional details and focusing on the facts. The house I gave to my grandson and his wife, the pending gift deed process, demanding rent. Let me guess, Albert said when I was done. You want to know if you can get the house back for yourself? Exactly. Well, if the donation process hasn't been legally finalized, then technically the house is still yours. But there are nuances. They've been living there for 2 years, right? Yes. They can claim a statute of limitations. Although 2 years isn't that long. It's also important, did they pay property taxes or did you? I did, I said. I paid all the taxes and insurance. That's good. I could hear the professional satisfaction in Albert's voice. Very good for our case. Do you still have the original deeds to the house? Yeah, it's all in the safe. That's good. I'll come by your place tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock. We'll go over the deeds and make a plan of action. I agreed and hung up. For the first time in a long time, I felt something akin to relief. Not joy. I wasn't happy at the thought of having to evict my own grandson, but at least there was clarity and a plan. Albert arrived exactly at 9, as promised. We spent a few hours going over documents and discussing strategy. The situation was even better than I'd thought. Since I'd never officially finalized the deed of gift, the house was still in my name. I paid taxes, insurance, and all the utility bills were also in my name, although Hugo and Payton paid them. Legally, they're tenants without a lease, Albert explained. We can start eviction proceedings on the basis of, well, on any grounds, really. It's your house. How long does it take? Usually a few weeks, but given the circumstances. He's thinking about it. I could speed things up. I have a judge I know who understands the importance of family matters. I nodded, feeling a mixture of determination and bitterness. Do what you need to do, Albert. I want my house back. The next 2 days passed in preparation. Albert drew up all the necessary documents. I signed them. We agreed that he would represent me if the case went to court. I hoped it wouldn't come to that Hugo and Payton would realize the seriousness of the situation and move out voluntarily. Naive hopes, as it turned out. On the 3rd day, Albert and I drove to the house. It was early morning, and I knew that Hugo had already left for work, and Payton had to be home. Her shift at the clinic started at noon. I rang the doorbell I'd fixed the day before. No one answered for a long time, but I could hear movement inside. Finally, the door opened, and Payton appeared on the doorstep, wearing a silk robe and a disgruntled expression on her face. What do you— She stopped short when she saw Albert. Who's this? Albert Cranston, Mr. Thorpe's attorney. He introduced himself, handing her a folder of documents. I'd like you to take a look at these papers. Payton took the folder and opened it. As she read, her face changed from annoyance to disbelief, then to shock, and finally to rage. "What is this nonsense?" She threw the folder on the floor. "You can't evict us. This is our house. You gave it to us." "Technically, no," Albert replied calmly. "Mr. Thorpe never completed the gifting process. He still owns the house, as evidenced by all the documents, including tax returns and insurance policies." "There must be some mistake," Payton shook her head. "Hugo said the house was ours. We have the papers." "A preliminary agreement of intent to donate," Albert clarified. "Not valid without notarization and registration of the transfer of ownership." Payton looked from Albert to me. "You can't do that. Not with Hugo. He's your grandson." "That's why I'm giving you a week to pack your things and find a new place to live," I said. "That's more than the law allows." "A week?" She laughed a nervous, hysterical laugh. "Are you crazy? Where are we going to find lodging in a week?" "That's not my problem," I shrugged. "Considering your demand to pay you $3,500 a month to see your grandson, I consider a week a very generous amount of time." Payton turned pale. "Hugo told you about it? It was just a joke. We never intended—" "Please save all the explanations for the court if you decide to contest the eviction," Albert intervened. "At this point, you have a choice. Either vacate the premises voluntarily within a week, or we will be forced to initiate a forced eviction through the bailiffs." Payton clenched her fists, her face contorted with rage. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "Both of you. Especially you, old man. You just lost the only grandson who was still in touch with you." "We'll see about that," I said calmly. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a look around the house. Since it's mine, I have every right to do so." "No way!" She tried to slam the door shut, but I managed to get my foot in the doorway. "Mrs. Thorpe," Albert's voice became harsh, "obstructing the rightful owner's access to his property may be considered trespassing. I wouldn't advise making your situation any worse." Payton stepped back, letting us inside. We walked through the house, inspecting each room. I was noting the damage that would need to be repaired when the house was mine again. Albert was taking pictures of everything on his phone, for documentation, he explained. When we got back to the front door, Payton stood there with her arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes were throwing lightning bolts. "Did you finish your inspection?" she asked venomously. "Satisfied?" "Quite," I nodded. "You'll receive an official eviction notice in the mail. You'll have exactly 7 days from the time you receive it." I turned to leave, but Payton grabbed my arm. "Wait!" Her tone suddenly changed, almost pleading. "Let's talk. I'm sure we can find a compromise." "I'm not interested in compromise," I replied, releasing my hand. "You made your position clear when you demanded rent for the house I gave you." "It was stupid, I admit," she shook her head. "I was upset, angry, but we can fix this. Hugo would be devastated if he knew you were evicting us." "Tell him the truth, the whole truth," I looked her in the eye. "Tell him how you plan to milk the old man, how you spent the renovation money on your own whims, how you manipulated him and me." Payton recoiled as if I'd hit her. "You can't do this," she whispered. "Not with Hugo. He's just starting a new job. He's finally got the confidence to—" "You're right," I nodded. "I won't do it, because unlike you, I do care about him." I left the house, and Albert followed me. We were getting in the car when Payton ran out onto the porch. "You're going to pay us $3,500 a month," she shouted, her voice breaking with rage. "You will pay if you ever want to see your grandson again." I didn't answer. Silently, I got into the car and started the engine. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror as I drove away was Payton standing on the porch, with her face contorted with rage, yelling something I couldn't make out. "It was intense," Albert remarked when we'd gotten a decent distance away. "Yes," I agreed, "and that's just the beginning." "Are you sure you want to go all the way?" he asked. "It could seriously affect your relationship with your grandson." I sighed. "She's already ruined that relationship, Albert. I'm just trying to salvage what can still be salvaged. including the house I bought with Eleanor. He nodded understandingly, and we spent the rest of the drive in silence. The eviction process didn't take a week as I'd originally planned, but almost a month. Hugo had begged for more time, and of course I couldn't refuse. As angry as I was at Payton, he was my grandson after all, and I could see his heart breaking between his wife and his grandfather. Eventually, they moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Hugo told me over the phone, short, dry, unemotional. It was as if he were giving me a weather report, not information about a major change in his life. I could hear Payton's voice in the background. She was saying something, and there was a familiar harshness in her tone. I didn't go into the house until they'd moved out completely. I didn't want to unnecessarily traumatize a relationship that was already hanging by a thread. When I finally opened the door with my key, I froze on the threshold, unable to believe my eyes. The house that I had once bought with such love, that I had renovated with my own hands, had turned into a veritable pigsty. Trash everywhere, stains on the carpets, holes in the walls, as if someone had deliberately wanted to do as much damage as possible before I left. And I knew exactly who that someone was. I spent a few days tidying up the house, threw out what could no longer be salvaged, scrubbed what could be cleaned. Neighbors stopped by, wondering what had happened, why the young couple had moved out so suddenly. I answered evasively, "Family matters, it happens, life is unpredictable." On the fourth day of cleaning, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw Hugo. He was standing there with his head down and his hands in his pockets, just like when I was a kid, apologizing for a broken window or torn pants. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. I stepped back silently, letting him into the house. He looked around, noticing the changes, the cleaned carpets, the holes in the walls, the new curtains. "You've already fixed everything," he said with a note of surprise in his voice. "Not everything," I shook my head. "The pipes in the upstairs bathroom are still leaking, and the flooring in the living room needs to be completely replaced." Hugo nodded, avoiding my gaze. "I can help with the repairs." "Don't you think that's a strange proposition, considering the circumstances?" He finally looked up. They were a mixture of shame and despair. "Grandpa, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize Payton was going to make such a mess before he left. By the time I realized, it was too late." I sighed and walked to the kitchen. Hugo followed me. I put the kettle on, an old habit inherited from Eleanor. She always said there was no conversation that wouldn't be made easier with a cup of hot tea. "How are you?" I asked, pulling out the cups. Hugo shrugged. "I'm okay. The job's good. The apartment is small, but it's livable." "And Payton?" His face instantly tensed up. She's doing okay. It's hard for her, of course." "Of course," I repeated, trying not to sound sarcastic. We drank our tea in silence. I didn't rush the conversation, knowing that Hugo would have to decide what to say and when to say it. He was always like that, thinking every word before he said it out loud. We were alike in that way. "Payton won't let me talk to you," he said finally, staring into his cup. "Says you ruined our lives, that because of you, we lost our house and now we have to live in a cramped apartment." I was silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know it's not true," he looked up. "I know that she wasn't always honest. With you. With me." "Why are you here, Hugo?" I asked bluntly. He took a deep breath. "Because you're my grandfather, and I don't want to lose you. Even if Payton is against it," I finished for him. He nodded. "I came here while she's at work. She doesn't know I'm here." I felt something clench inside. My adult grandson, a 30-year-old man, having to sneak out to visit his own grandfather is like a teenager sneaking out of the house for a forbidden party. "Hugo," I put my hand on his shoulder, "I'll always be happy to see you. Always. But I don't want to be the cause of problems between you and Payton. It's your life, your choice." "I know," he nodded. It's just, I need time to work things out, to convince her that hanging out with you isn't not a threat to us. I squeezed his shoulder. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Hugo smiled for the first time in our entire conversation. It was the smile I'd missed. He finished his tea and stood up. I gotta go. Payton's going to be home from work soon, and if I'm not home, go. I got up too. And Hugo, thanks for coming. He gave me an awkward, manly hug with a pat on the back, and then he left, promising to call me next week. I watched him get in his car and drive away, and I thought about how strange life is, how one decision to donate a house could have such unpredictable consequences. That evening of the same day, a call came in from my daughter Verity. She rarely called for nothing, usually only on holidays or when she needed help with her grandchildren, so I knew right away something was wrong. "Dad," she began without preamble, "what's going on with you and Hugo?" I sighed, preparing myself for a difficult conversation. "What do you know?" "Just what Payton told me, that you kicked them out of the house you gave them 2 years ago without warning, that they're now stuck in a tiny apartment they can barely afford." "And you believed it?" I asked, trying not to show the irritation in my voice. "I don't know what to believe, Dad," she sounded tired. "That's why I'm calling. I want to hear your side of the story." I told her everything, about Payton and Hugo asking for money for repairs they didn't make, the overheard conversations about milking the old man, about demanding to pay $3,500 a month for the right to see her grandson. Verity was silent for a long time after I told her. "I can't believe it," she said finally. "Payton always seemed so sweet, caring." "She's a good actress," I replied dryly. "What does Hugo say?" "He's in the middle of something. He loves his wife, but he doesn't want to lose me." "What are you going to do?" I shrugged, even though she couldn't see it. "Move on. What else is there left?" "Dad," her voice softened, "maybe we should try to make up, for Hugo's sake. With the woman who called me an old man out of his mind and tried to use me as an ATM?" I grinned. "That's hardly possible, Verity." She sighed. "You know, Aunt Doris called yesterday. Said Payton was in tears telling her how you tried to turn Hugo against her, how you accused her of every sin in the world. Doris is Eleanor's sister, who I've always had a strained relationship with. It's no wonder she immediately sided with Payton." "And you believed her?" "I don't know who to believe, Dad," Verity repeated. "I just want my family not to fall apart." After that conversation, I started getting texts and calls from other relatives. Eleanor's cousin sent an angry letter accusing me of being callous and cruel. A niece I hadn't seen in 10 years suddenly called to express her support for poor Hugo and Payton. Even an old buddy from work, Harold, stopped by specifically to ask if it was true that I had thrown my grandson out on the street. Payton has launched a real campaign to smear my name, and the sad thing is, a lot of people believed her, because she was 32 and I was 68, because she could cry on command and speak in a heartfelt voice. Because a story about an angry old man hurting a young family is easier to accept than the truth about a manipulative daughter-in-law taking advantage of her husband's naivety and her father-in-law's kindness. A week after Hugo's visit, I received a call from my younger sister Olivia. Unlike the others, she didn't start with accusations or questions. She simply asked how I was feeling and if I needed help with home repairs. "So you don't think I'm a villain?" I couldn't resist asking. Olivia snorted. "Walter, I've known you for 65 years. You're stubborn, grouchy, and sometimes insufferable, but you're not evil. If you evicted Hugo and his wife, you had a good reason." I felt a lump in my throat. Olivia always had a way of getting to the point. "Thanks, Olive." "You're welcome, brother. By the way, I heard something about your sister-in-law. I think you should know." Olivia lived in a neighboring town where she worked as an administrator at the local hospital. She knew everyone and everything, and everyone knew her. "Like what?" My friend Beverly works at the credit union. I won't go into details, but, your sister-in-law has debt problems. Serious problems. I'm straightening up in my chair. How serious? She's been taking out high-interest loans, a lot of loans, and not always in legal places, if you know what I mean. I did. Lyman and the surrounding areas were littered with fast money places offering lousy interest rates. Some of them operated on the edge of the law, if not beyond it. Why does she need so much money? I asked myself rather than my sister. Beverly doesn't know that, but she says Payton withdraws large sums of cash on a regular basis, and she has an account that your grandson probably doesn't know about. That information got me thinking. What if Payton's manipulations and her attempts to squeeze money out of me weren't just greed? What if there was more to it than that, like debts that Hugo didn't realize he had? Olive, can you find out more? I'll try, the sister replied. But be careful, Walter. If she really is in trouble with illegal creditors, it could be dangerous. After talking to Olivia, I couldn't stop thinking about Payton and her secret financial life. What if she got Hugo involved in some kind of scheme? What if my grandson was in danger and didn't even realize it? I decided to do my own investigation. I started by asking Albert, my lawyer, to look into Payton Eswell, her background, her credit history, possible legal problems. Then I contacted an old acquaintance, Richard Fleming, who used to be a police officer and was now a private investigator. "Don't tell me you've fallen in love in your old age," Richard joked when I explained that I needed information about a young woman. "Worse," I replied. "That's my grandson's wife." Richard whistled. "Family matters, the most complicated. But I'll see what I can do." Over the next week, I spent the next week renovating the house and waiting for news from Albert and Richard. Hugo called twice, briefly, clearly in a hurry. Both times he said everything was fine, that he and Payton were slowly settling in. He didn't ask questions about the house, didn't mention our fight. It was like we were just making polite conversation between distant acquaintances, not family. Finally, Friday night, I got a call from Richard. "Walter, are you home? I'd like to stop by. There's some information that would be better discussed in person." An hour later, Richard was sitting in my living room with a folder of documents and a serious expression on his face. "I have to say, your sister-in-law is an interesting person," he began, opening the folder. "And by interesting, I mean with a rich past." "How rich?" Richard pulled out several sheets of printouts. "Let's start with the fact that Payton Eswell isn't exactly Payton Eswell, or, more accurately, she wasn't always." He handed me a picture of a young woman with dark hair and a nose piercing. I would never have recognized her as Payton if it weren't for her distinctive sharp chin and piercing gaze. Her real name is Pamela Esterhazy. Born in Broadview, which is about 200 miles from here. She was arrested for fraud at the age of 19 for running a credit card scheme with her then-boyfriend. She got probation as a minor at the time of the crime. I listened in silence, trying to get my head around the fact that the woman who had been my grandson's wife for the past 2 years was actually a con artist with a criminal record. "After that, she changed her name," Richard continued. "Legally, through the courts. She moved here, got a job in a dental clinic. At first glance, a new life." "And at second glance," Richard chuckled. "And on the second, she had debts to 3 microfinance organizations, 2 of which were, shall we say, not quite legal. The total amount is about $50,000. I whistled. That was a lot of money. "And what did she spend it on?" This is where it gets interesting. Richard pulled out another sheet of paper. "She has a bank account in Willowbrook, about 30 miles from here. She transfers money into it regularly and withdraws it in cash. Also," he paused, "she has a P.O. box at the post office there in Willowbrook, and she gets regular letters from one Derek Sanders." "Who's that?" "Her ex-boyfriend, the same one she was running credit card scams with. He did 3 years, real time. Got out a year ago." I leaned back in my chair, digesting the information. Payton, or Pamela, didn't just have debts. She was in touch with a criminal ex-boyfriend, and apparently she'd kept it all from Hugo. There's one more thing. Richard handed me the last sheet. A copy of a police report from one Vince Moretti. He claims that Pamela Esterhazy and her accomplice tricked his mother, an elderly woman with dementia, into signing a deed of gift for the house. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but that sounds a lot like what she was trying to do to me, I finished for him. Richard nodded. Your sister-in-law seems to have a certain modus operandi. She finds elderly people with assets, gains their trust, and tries to gain control of their assets. Through my grandson, I shook my head. God, Hugo has no idea who he's messing with. The question is what you're going to do with this information. Richard gathered the papers back into the folder. Are you going to go to the police? I wondered. On the one hand, Payton, or Pamela, was clearly breaking the law. On the other, she was still my grandson's wife, and if I filed a report, it could ruin Hugo's life forever. No, I finally decided. Not yet. I have to talk to Hugo first. He deserves to know the truth. Be careful, Richard warned me. If she realizes you've discovered her secret, she could become dangerous. People like that stop at nothing when they feel threatened. I nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation. What had started out as a family dispute over money had turned into something much darker. Now I had to figure out how to protect my grandson without destroying his life completely. After Richard left, I sat in silence for a long time, going over what I had learned in my head. Payton was using Hugo to get to my money and property. She might even be planning something similar to what she'd tried to do to Vince Moretti's mother. I thought about how she manipulated my grandson, how she isolated him from his family, how she gradually drove a wedge between us. Classic abuser tactics. First cut the victim off from the support of loved ones, and then completely subjugate them to her will. And worst of all, Hugo didn't even seem to realize he was a pawn in her game. He truly loved this woman, trusted her, protected her. How could I open his eyes without breaking his heart? The next morning I called Albert and told him everything I'd learned from Richard. My old friend listened in silence, then asked, "What do you want, Walter? What is your plan?" "I want to protect Hugo," I answered without hesitation. "To get him out of this situation before it's too late." "Then you need hard evidence," Albert said. "Something he can't ignore or blame on your bias." "I have a file of documents from Richard, police reports, financial statements. That may not be enough." Albert shook his head. "Hugo is in love. He'll look for any explanation to justify his wife. You need something more direct." "Like what?" "Like he heard or saw something that can't be interpreted in two ways. I've been thinking, how do I set up a situation like this? How do I get Payton to show her true colors in front of Hugo?" And then it hit me. "Albert, do you remember the trust fund account we set up for Hugo when he turned 18? "Sure," the lawyer nodded. "He should have access to it at 35. Another 5 years to wait." "What if—" I paused, formulating a thought. "What if I decided to change the terms? Give him access sooner?" Albert squinted. "And let Payton know about it, but not Hugo." "Exactly," I nodded. "We'll see how she reacts to the news of the unexpected money. It's risky," Albert warned, "but it could work. Just be prepared that she might try to convince Hugo to withdraw the money immediately." "Let her try," I grinned. "It would only strengthen my position." The plan was risky, but I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and watch my grandson fall victim to a con artist who was taking advantage of his trust and love. I decided to act immediately. I called Payton's cell phone, a number I still had from when we were still on speaking terms. "What do you want?" she asked me instead of greeting me. "To talk," I answered calmly. "There's something important about Hugo and you. If this is another attempt to drive a wedge between us—" "It's about money," I interrupted her. "A rather large sum of money." There was a pause. "I'm listening," she said at last, and there was obvious interest in her voice. "Not on the phone," I answered. "Let's meet. Tomorrow, at Joe's, at 10 in the morning. Hugo will be at work at that time," she said. "I know. This is just between us. Bye." Another pause. "Okay," she finally agreed. "Tomorrow at 10 at Joe's." I hung up the phone and smiled. Payton had taken the bait. Now all I had to do was play my cards right and make her show her true colors. Joe's cafe was half empty at this hour. A few retirees at a far table, a couple students with laptops, a barista wiping down an already clean counter, a typical Tuesday morning in Lyman. I arrived 15 minutes ahead of schedule and took a table in the corner where I had a good view of the entire room. It was an old inspector's habit to always see the big picture. Payton showed up at exactly 10 o'clock, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. She looked impeccable. Light blue dress, neat hair, restrained makeup. A typical young professional in a hurry to get to work. No one would have suspected her of being a con artist with a criminal record. "Walter," she nodded, sitting down across from me. "I hope you do have something important to tell me. I took a day off work for this meeting." "Very important," I confirmed. "But first, maybe some coffee?" She glanced at her watch, a slim one with a thin leather strap. New, I noticed. I wondered how many loans she had taken out to maintain her image as a successful woman. "Okay," she agreed. "Latte, no sugar." I called the waitress over and ordered a latte for Payton and a black coffee for myself. When the girl stepped away, Payton folded her hands on the table and leaned forward. "So?" "I've decided to change the terms of Hugo's trust fund," I said without preamble. Her eyes widened slightly, the only sign that my words had touched a nerve. "What trust fund? Didn't Hugo tell you about it?" I pretended to be surprised. "Eleanor and I opened it when Hugo turned 18, a large enough sum that it should have been available to him when he was 35. Payton shook his head slowly. "No, he'd never mentioned it. Of course he didn't mention it, because I just made up that trust fund. Or rather, I exaggerated. Hugo did have a small account that I'd set up for him years ago, but it was a modest sum, intended more as a rainy day backup than as a serious inheritance." "Well, maybe he just forgot," I shrugged. "In any case, I decided to change the terms, considering your current circumstances." The waitress brought our drinks. Payton didn't even look at her, focusing on me. "What changes?" "I want Hugo to have access to the money now, not 5 years from now," I answered, sipping my coffee. "I think you need it more now than later." Payton picked up the cup but didn't drink it. Her fingers twitched slightly, the only sign of excitement she couldn't hide. "That's very generous of you," she said carefully, "especially after everything that's happened." "Family is family," I said with my hands folded. "Despite our differences, I still care about Hugo, and you as his wife." The last words were hard to say, but I tried not to let it show on my face. "How much money are we talking about?" Payton asked, trying to sound casual. "About $250,000, I answered, watching her reaction, "including the accumulated interest." She couldn't hide her surprise. Her eyes widened, and the hand holding the cup stopped halfway. "$250,000? She asked in a whisper. "The bank will tell me the exact amount when we change the terms of the trust." Payton finally took a sip of her latte, clearly trying to collect her thoughts. I could see the gears in her head turning, calculating the options. "Why did you decide to do this now?" she asked, looking me straight in the eye. "After kicking us out of the house, after all the accusations." "Because I'm still Hugo's grandfather," I answered, "and because I don't want him to suffer because of our conflict." She studied my face, trying to find a catch. But I was sincere, at least when it came to caring for Hugo. After that meeting, I waited for Payton's reaction, And I wasn't surprised when Richard told me that she'd gone straight to Willowbrook to meet with Derek Sanders, her former accomplice. The plan had worked. The bait of a fictitious trust fund had gotten her to activate. The next day, Hugo came to my place as we'd agreed. I prepared lunch, his favorite roast from Eleanor's recipe, and after a brief conversation about the weather and work, I finally got to the point. "Hugo, there's something we need to talk about," I said, pulling out a pre-prepared file folder. "It's about Payton, more specifically, Pamela Esterhazy." The surprise on his face confirmed my fears. He knew about the name change, but not why. "How do you know that name?" he asked warily. "So she told you," I said. "Yes," Hugo nodded. "She changed her name after a difficult time in her life. She wanted a fresh start." I showed him the contents of the folder: police fraud reports, account statements, photos of meetings with Derek, a recording of a phone call in which she discussed how to access the trust fund money. Hugo studied the documents for a long time, his face changing from disbelief to shock and painful realization. "This can't be true," he whispered, looking at the pictures of Payton's meeting with Derek yesterday. "She said she was at work." "She lied," I said softly, "like she'd lied from the beginning." Hugo shook his head negatively. "There has to be some explanation. Maybe this Derek guy is just a friend. A friend she was committing fraud with and was going to marry before he went to prison?" I sighed. "Hugo, look at the facts. A pattern that repeats itself over and over. We talked for almost 2 hours. I explained how I'd discovered her real identity, how I'd verified the information through Richard, how I'd set the trap with the fictitious trust fund." Hugo listened, occasionally asking questions, but mostly silently accepting the bitter truth. "What should I do, grandfather?" he finally asked. "That's for you to decide," I answered honestly. "I can only show you the truth. The decision is yours." Hugo left with a folder of documents, promising to call me after he talked to Payton. But instead of a call, there was silence. 3 days without news that had me seriously worried. On the 4th day, I returned home to find Hugo in my kitchen, cooking dinner. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes, but his eyes were determined. "You were right," he said simply. "About everything. She didn't even deny it when I showed her the papers. Just laughed at how naive I was." We talked for a long time that night. Hugo told me how Payton, cornered, had confessed everything, that she'd chosen him because of me, because of the prospect of having access to my money and property, how she'd planned the long game but lost patience when I started noticing inconsistencies, and how, all along, she'd kept in touch with Derek, her true partner not only in crime but in life. "She left with him," Hugo said quietly, "took all her valuables and disappeared, said I was just a means to an end. Hugo came to live with me. There was no long discussion, just a tacit acceptance that right now he needed a safe place to come to his senses. I gave him his old room, which had remained unchanged since he had visited us every summer. A week later, I received an unexpected call from a woman who introduced herself as Lindsay Coleman, Payton's co-worker from the dental clinic. "I'm calling to thank you," she said without preamble. "You were the only one who saw her real face. I worked with her for 3 years, and all that time I tried to warn people, but no one listened." Lindsay explained how Payton manipulated co-workers, deceived patients, built a web of lies around herself, and how she had sent her an angry text before she left, accusing me of ruining her perfect plan. "She was calculating and ruthless," Lindsay said. "Used people and then threw them away when they were useless, including your grandson. After that conversation, I made some important decisions. The first was to rewrite the will, removing Payton from it, although she was still only listed there as Hugo's wife. The second was to start divorce proceedings on Hugo's behalf, gathering all the necessary evidence of fraud and deceit. And third, perhaps most importantly, sell the house in Lyman and move." "Are you sure?" Hugo asked when I shared this idea with him. "You've lived here all your life." "That's exactly why," I replied. "There are too many memories, good and bad. It's time to start a new chapter." We chose a small coastal town about 200 miles from Lyman, far enough away to make a fresh start, but close enough that Hugo could continue working for his company, just a little longer commute. On moving day, as the last boxes were loaded into the van, I walked around the house one last time, saying goodbye to the place where I'd spent most of my life. In every room were voices from the past: Eleanor's laughter, Verity's baby cries, little Hugo's enthusiastic cries as he opened his Christmas presents. But as I closed the door and sat in the car next to my grandson, I felt not sadness, but a strange relief. It was as if the weight I'd been carrying all these years was finally beginning to let go. "Are you ready?" Hugo asked, starting the engine. I looked at the house that was no longer mine and nodded. "Ready. Let's go home." We pulled onto the highway, leaving Lyman behind, with its ghosts of the past and painful memories. Ahead was a new life, without toxic relationships, without manipulation, without lies, a life where we could start over. And while I knew the scars would remain, both mine and Hugo's, I also knew we would endure, because we were a real family built on love and honesty, not lies and self-interest. "You know," Hugo said, looking at the road, "I never thanked you properly for saving me from her." "You're my grandson," I replied simply. "I will always protect you, even from yourself." He smiled, for the first time in a long time, a genuine, easy smile. "I know, grandfather, I know."